Hey, thanks so much for listening to the Ridge Community Church podcast. My name is John. I'm one of the pastors on staff at the Ridge, and our vision is to bring the hope of Jesus into every home. So as a piece of that, our goal each week is to bring you something that's hopeful and helpful. So subscribe to this podcast to make sure you don't miss any hopeful and helpful conversations. Hey everyone, and thanks for listening to this episode of the Ridge Community Church podcast. If you find today's episode hopeful and helpful, then please follow or subscribe, and then rate and review so that more people can find the conversation. In today's episode, the Ridge's online pastor, Tyler Volkers, joins me to chat about books. I guess more specifically, I asked him to share 3 of the books that have made the biggest impact on his faith and why they made that impact. Now, he also shares how he reads to grow and learn and some more fun stuff as well. This is my conversation with Tyler. Well, hi, Tyler. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
John, it's always fun to be here. And man, thanks to everyone for taking some time to listen to this.
So I have to ask, has it officially become summer in Wisconsin?
It did for a day, but now you see me, John, I'm in my hoodie. I know you can't see this in the recording right now, but we went from like 85 to like 65 in about 20 minutes. And
nice.
But no, it's officially summer. My kids are out of school, and we're in the they're actually back into summer school and day camp and doing all the fun summer things. And, you know, we've had some cookouts and whatnot with friends and neighbors. But yeah, it's officially summertime here, I guess.
So what does a dream summer look like for the Volkers family?
Dream summer. Oh, well, you sent me, hey, you know, what am I looking forward to this summer? But it should be a good summer. So this summer for us, actually going to start with my grandparents are celebrating their 60th wedding anniversary. And so we're going to reunite with my family and celebrate them in a little bit. And then summer for me kind of kicks off in a few short days when my wife and I celebrate our anniversary, which is on June 23rd. And so
how many years is that?
We get 16 years this year. So I'll take her for a drive and say, hey, now I can officially drive, you know, as the age of our...
That's good. I haven't heard that one before. That's good.
Yeah. So I don't know if it's good or not, but yeah. So we're celebrating 16 years, which is really cool. Really cool that we're hitting that, and it's been fun. And so we'll have that, and then actually right when we celebrate that, we're taking the kids on a road trip, and we're gonna have a good time. Actually going to the through the Midwest, but like the eastern part of the Midwest. And so hitting some Indiana dunes, and we're going to do some stops in Cincinnati. And it's kind of funny with, some of the effects from the pandemic still. My kids during the pandemic found the Cincinnati Zoo's social media channel with my wife. And they've like had this like love affair with all of these animals here. Like we're big zoo people. We go to the Milwaukee Zoo all the time. Yeah. And so they know all the animals and they've seen it. So they finally want to see them like face. So we'll actually go through Cincinnati, go to the zoo there, go to Kings Island, and then still continue to work our way around. So we're planning a fun trip. And then shortly after that, John, you get the 4th of July, which I love 4th of July. That's like your neighbor party, like hangout time. And, you know, fireworks and all that stuff and people everywhere. It's awesome. Then we wrap it up with, I call it the birthday gauntlet. Both my kids were born like in the late summer. And so we just go celebrate birthdays all the time. And that usually will wrap it up. But that's kind of our fun summer plans.
I feel like you just described like the epitome of what I think of when I think of like a Midwest Wisconsin summer, which is like packed.
Taking just life and cramming it in 3 months.
Yes. Exactly. Yeah. But I mean, a part of that is like you mentioned, like travel. I know that for a lot of people, let me try to do this segue here. A lot of people, you know, travel, vacations, things like that. That's a lot of times where people will break out books or, you know, maybe listen to Audible, do audio books. And for a lot of people, that might be their main source of time when they actually get a chance to read or enjoy reading. In honor of that, I'd love to chat with you about some of your favorite or most impactful books you've been reading, either recently or if there's one you're like, wow, I got to share this book, particularly on the idea of faith. So when I kind of broach that topic, is there anything that comes to mind right away?
Yeah, John, I wanted to give us, if we're going to give you a short summer reading list related to faith and building faith, I wanted to give you 3. And the challenge for me was actually limiting it down to 3. When you broach this idea and topic, one of the things I do is every year I read a book. When I read, I create an Evernote file for each year, and I just list all the books that I've read that year with a short summary of what a key takeaway that I took from it. And so, John, it was a lot of fun just kind of going through those files and just reading, like, hey, some of these most meaningful books. But I'm going to share 3 and then comment, comment back and forth, whatever ones you think. Yeah. We should go from here. So, but you mentioned faith specifically, so I'm keeping it in the minds of faith. And if there's other topics that come up with other ideas, I can share this too. But for my top 3 that I would say, if you're going to read something to build your faith, here they are. First one, maybe it's because he recently passed away, but I thought of Prodigal God from Tim Keller right away. And the reason Tim Keller is just great thinker, and he just passed away due to pancreatic cancer. And for those who
aren't familiar, maybe we can break these and do chunks one at a time.
Yeah.
Timothy Keller, if you've never heard of him before, could you give us like a brief synopsis of who Timothy Keller is?
Yeah, Tim Keller, he was a pastor in New York, great author, great thinker, probably one of the better Christian thinkers of our time, John. And so can really just take very, very big theological concepts and write about them in a way that can help many followers of Jesus just build their faith. And the reason why I wanted to pick Prodigal God specifically, John, is he does a great job where he really breaks down Luke chapter 15. And I read this at a time where it began to open my eyes of how, we talk a lot at the Ridge about how we go after the one son who walked away from the father. And that's important. And Tim does a fantastic job about why is that the father's priority? But then what he also does in this book is does a great job of talking about the other son, the older son, how even though he was there with the father, he was still emotionally distant from God because he defined his following his dad by keeping all the rules. And then he got jealous when dad was excited about the younger son. And really what the result was both sons were separated from the father. And what the father wanted was to bring both sons relationally back to him. And so for me, it just did a lot of great heart work of realizing hey, there's times I've been like that older son who was out in the field, jealous and envious of when the father was throwing the celebration for the younger son, when really what the father wants is everyone to be reconnected with him. And so really it aligns your heart with what God's heart is, which is really, hey, God wants us all to be found and all to be with him. So I think it's just a really fantastic book that in my opinion might be a required book for any follower of Jesus to read, but I could be wrong on that one.
No, so. I mean, that kind of dovetails into my question about it. When you think of the Prodigal God, I like to think of books in some ways like this. It's like somebody comes to you and they ask this question, and then your response is, okay, you got to read the Prodigal God because that's going to help you out a ton. What would be the question that somebody is thinking of or asks you about that would make you want to read Prodigal God? It sounds a little bit like it's like, hey, I'm a Christian, what should I read? And you're like, read this. But beyond that.
Yeah. Yeah. The question that you'd be asking is, what is the heart of God the Father? And his particular relationship to his sons. And we often, especially if you relate more to the older brother who keeps the rules, and you're like, well, hey, I've done this my whole life, and I should get this and I deserve this. What we often miss is we are just as distant from the father as the younger son. And what the father wants for us is for all of us to be reconnected. I think it was, one of the most, telling things of the older son was he didn't care that the other younger brother was lost. And yet God's heart was like, no, our family member, this brother of yours is missing. And what God the Father wants for us is to all of us be reunited with him and to have the heart for what he wants, which the heart is, hey, anyone who's disconnected from God, he wants them reconnected with him.
I mean, I love that idea of connecting with the heart of God. I mean, that's a prayer that we've heard our lead pastor Mark talk about a ton, where, he just wants us to develop, and he's constantly praying to have the heart of God. And I mean, I love just breaking down that story and kind of diving deep into it, because it really does give you a chance to, I think, see yourself in a, I don't know, it's really easy to see yourself in a holier than thou, I know I'm going through some King James there, but, type of mentality, and kind of that recentering on gosh, God has something bigger for you than this idea of your own goodness.
Yeah. Yeah. You ready for book 2?
Yeah, hit me.
All right. So book 2, kind of a somewhat similar vein, but this is more practical. And I'm thinking through the lens of, hey, if I'm going to have any follower of Jesus or anyone who's looking at this to build their faith, one of which I think this is going to be very practical for you. But I love the book Blessed by Dave and John Ferguson. And here's why I would give this from a faith building perspective. You know, John, if you've been a part of the Ridge, we've just gone through the series Lost Cause, where we've talked about the heart of the Father, which I just mentioned that in Prodigal God. What Blessed does is John and Dave, they do a great job of breaking down these 5 everyday practices that they see Jesus do in his everyday life that you and I can implement today, like right now, and do that to invest in someone in our life who may be far from God, to help them maybe see how great God is and explore checking out faith there. So it's a real practical book. And especially in summer, these 5 everyday ways, we can take advantage and put these into practice today and begin to experience our faith build as we're helping someone explore faith through these five basic ways.
So as you're reading through that book, were you like, oh wow, I'm gonna like go chapter by chapter, I'm gonna like start trying to implement these things one at a time? Or was it like there was because that one sounds a lot more practical than maybe the Prodigal God. So how was that influencing kind of how you were thinking and what you wanted to do?
So these 5 everyday practices, which we've taught on them, you know, full candor before in the Ridge, and if you see them, but I mean, what a great thing about reading a book about this rather than just listening to a message is you can take these steps further. And so you can begin implementing it. John, honestly, putting these practices into play over the last couple of years has built the friendships that I have with those in my life who aren't yet following Jesus, who don't go to the Ridge. No, I work at the Ridge, but you know, there's a friendship there just because at the bare bones, I've just been putting these 5 practices into ways, finding ways to pray for them, listen to them, eat with them, serve them. And then, you know, there's been times where I get to share parts of my story now, and it's been leading to more of these conversations, but it's such a helpful way to be able to do this.
Do you have a favorite one of those principles? Like, is there one of those 5 that you just like naturally gravitate towards more naturally, and like you started to read it and you were like, okay, I'm really excited about doing this thing?
Yeah, my natural response is to serve others. And the reason why I think that is, I was talking about this in one of our Lost Cause training huddles, was because I naturally lean more introverted, John. I don't know if that's a surprise or not. For most people who know me, not too surprised by that. And so you can almost serve others without having to go out of your way to converse. But the challenge with that is, I know. And so that's my more natural way. I'm not saying it's the right way.
No.
And so what I've learned is, what I've learned is when I stretch myself to spend time and listen and take the step of faith to invite over to eat, what you discover is different ways that you can serve them in a way that practically meets their need. You know, so that way you can, you know, like before I would just, hey, I'm going to serve my neighbors and I'm going to mow all their lawns and shovel, you know, all their driveways, which is important and a kind thing to do. But it isn't really meeting their needs, especially when my neighbor next door, you know, is 5 years younger than me. He's jacked. He's a football coach. I mean, he's got it, you know, he's fine. But there's been other ways that I've gotten to know him that, hey, we meet their needs and serve them in different ways.
Yeah. I love how, I think that you touched on a really good point there, Tyler, when you mentioned how when you're reading a book, you can kind of sit in it a little bit more. I've noticed that too. Like maybe you hear a message or a conversation and it's really interesting. And then, you know, you get a chance to read on a topic and you just feel like you immerse a little bit more and you get the chance to have your own ideas flowing around the topics that they're talking about. And so I love that idea of, okay, here's this principle. I'm going to take it. I'm going to apply it as soon as I can. And that I think gives the book staying power rather than just becoming like head knowledge. You know, because I mean, ultimately, that's why you read books on these things is so that they actually make a difference and impact the life that you're doing. But any other thoughts on Bless before you share your third one?
The thought that I have with the comment to what you just mentioned, John, is I've heard it read like this book they're reading. for whatever reason is the right time for you to imagine having this conversation with the author, having a coffee with them where you're learning them, and let them speak into the context of how you're reading this at this point too. And so take, for example, Bless. If you read that right now in the summer, I mean, again, all these principles you can apply right now in the summer because it's just the most opportune time. And let it read you as much as you're reading it. That's
really interesting. Let me dive into that for a second. So you're saying like you're reading, we'll use because you mentioned the serve thing, right? So you're reading this chapter on serve, and instead of just reading it as like practical, you're saying, okay, what if I asked the author a question about this area of my life, this is how they would answer it given this context? Is that kind of what you're thinking there?
Yeah, the way that we'll take that one, for example, where I think Dave and John just do a great job of highlighting, like, hey, listen to your neighbors in a way that you identify a way that you can serve them that actually meets their needs. I mean, that's how I understand is the premise of their whole idea of serving others. And so for me, the takeaway is like, hey, I'm not just going to go blindly serve people just to blindly serve people and give, moto because they didn't ask for it. But hey, I'm serving and I check it off and I go and move on. Like, that's not doing good for anyone.
Right.
Unless they really needed it. And so I think that for me is the point of like, I need to listen to their story and understand who they are. And then the application for me then is as I listen to them, then I'll see opportunities to get to serve them. There was one time with one of my friends, we were out for a run and we were talking and he was telling me about something deeply personal in his life, a significant event that came up. And I showed up at that event as a way to serve him. And this friend was like, texting me later. He's like, that meant so much to me.
Yeah.
And it was the idea of listening. And so it was a result of reading that. So
I love that. Super practical. All right. Number 3. Actually, you know what? 3, like, I feel like we're doing this. Are there any, this total curveball here, any honorable mentions before we hit your final book? You're looking at your list, classic, right? Here's my top 5, but just missed books.
We did not plan this, but actually I did. I wrote down some honorable mentions.
Yes.
So we'll fly through these ones real quick, John. I wanted to give some bonus books in the areas outside of faith because there's times where I read different things. And so I thought of one for parents. If you have kids in your life and you're wondering, what do I do? Parenting, Getting It Right by Andy and Sandra Stanley has, I think for me, has been the best book I've read so far this year. As far it has been a really strong book from them about the idea of how to relationally lead and love and serve your kids and the goal for raising your kids. And it's powerful. So if you have a child of any age, I really would recommend Parenting, Getting It Right. A marriage book, like specifically speaking into marriages. So if you're engaged or married or, however long, Vertical Marriage by Dave and Ann Wilson, I think is one of the strongest books I've read on a marriage and how to build, what does it mean to really build a marriage practically about, to follow Jesus and come closer to one another. And so, that's 2 honorable mentions. And then 2 other faith related honorable mentions I wanted to give. Ruthless Elimination of Hurry by John Mark Comer. I think is a fantastic book and just really, really good. And then I wrote down also 2 that built my faith as helpful. Anxious for Nothing by Max Lucado a few years ago was really, really powerful. And both of those books, we've actually taken some ideas and taught on those at the Ridge in different series.
Yeah. That's how a book is really like settled with our staff when we're like, no, we're gonna use some of these principles and teach about it. But man, that's a power list right there. I love that. Okay, and you know what? We will link those books in the show notes. Maybe the authors can thank us for getting a little bit of a. We'll give them a little bit of credit.
And we get nothing.
We get absolutely nothing. Yeah.
We absolutely get nothing. So this is fine. Let's just be clear about that. So
yeah. Okay. So your final book.
So I don't know if this is a build-up because I didn't do this in a countdown order or whatnot. And I was thinking about book 3, but going back to the question, John, they said of building faith. And one book that really, really built my faith. This is a throwback, John. This book might be older than you. I'm not entirely sure. I'll have to double check it. But I actually not that one. But I did, actually I referred this book, a couple of weeks ago and an individual picked it up and said, hey, this is still helpful for him. So here it is. The Case for Christ, by Strobel.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
And here's why I felt like this is important, and this is really, really helpful for me. Going through high school, early college, you're starting to wonder about your faith. Is almost like, hey, have I checked my brain at the door by believing this stuff? And what the Case for Christ did for me, and what Lee I thought did for me was, many probably familiar with the story. He was a journalist, an atheist. His wife became a follower of Jesus. He wanted to investigate it to prove how wrong his wife was in following Jesus, and was just so compelled by the evidence that he said, no, there actually really is a reason to follow Jesus. And he made the decision to follow Jesus, and has led many people to follow Jesus since then. I believe there's a movie about this, but I haven't watched it yet. Powerful book. And just even reading it as an 18, 19-year-old and letting reasoning kind of build up in my mind, even as I'm going into college classes. I went to a public university that was trying to refute and dispute these ideas. The ideas that came out of Case for Christ for me were very, very helpful.
Yeah, man. So so that was like really on in your faith journey then. So that was really formational.
Mm-hmm.
Have you had like thoughts come back to that book? Like your, I don't know, in your day to day, I'm sure you wouldn't think about it that often necessarily, but have you had moments where you kind of come back to that as like a grounding thing when you have doubts or stuff like that?
Moments for me to come back to sometimes. And then when I'm meeting with others and discussing with others who I know are bumping into those questions, who are a little bit more intellectual in nature and have significant questions. And it's not because they're trying to poke or prod. They're just generally curious and have general questions. Yeah. That's when this has been helpful for me to refer and have them read and come back with discussions and questions. And so, yeah.
I'm curious, when you find people like, cause I know sometimes we like to, it's really easy for people who follow Jesus to, they know somebody who doesn't follow God and they're like, hey, just read this Case for Christ book. And then boom, magic light will switch for you, and that's not necessarily what you're saying, right? It's more along the lines of somebody is really like genuinely, I'll call it searching. They're really asking these questions because they have this heart and desire to know, or they already believe, but they're like kind of wrestling with some like the intellectual stuff. Is that more what you're saying?
Yeah, it depends on the context, but if I'm talking with someone who has these questions or is wrestling with these questions, often what I'll offer to do, like again, this goes back to the serving aspect, is if I know that there's a particular issue that is bringing up a struggle or an obstacle, and if I know that there's a resource that has been, I think, at least helpful, I don't want to do the old, answer like, hey, just read a book on it and everything's gonna be fixed, because that isn't super helpful.
Yeah.
But what I do, John, is I offer to go to them again and say, hey, would you be willing to read through this and meet up and discuss this and talk through this? And then if they counter and say, yeah, but here's another resource, I want to do the same with you. Like I'd be willing to read and discuss and learn and think through together, because that's a way to serve them and help them explore and go through that exploration process with that other person.
What a cool testament to your willingness to like have genuine relationship and conversation where you're like, we can go through this together. It's not me just like walking away from the relationship and telling you to work on yourself or whatever,
right?
Okay. So real quick, just wonder if there's general reading principles. Okay. So somebody's like, tells you, hey, Tyler, I'm not a reader. I read in high school and it was, To Kill a Mockingbird or something like that. I almost said To Kill a Mockingjay, not Hunger Games here, not Hunger Games.
I can relate more to the Hunger Games.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
So that's good.
That's their extent of how much they like reading. Is there like a way that you'd encourage them? Would you say, hey, try out audiobook? How do you talk somebody through that if they're like, I'm not much of a reader? Because I think both of us would say, even if you're not a reader, there can be a tremendous amount of value in just like the ideas and even the conversations that you can have surrounding books or audiobooks and things like that.
Yeah. I encourage a high value of just learning overall, is the general principle. And so what I would encourage anyone to do is just try to find some ways that you can be helpful to learn. And so, John, for me, honestly, one of the biggest ways that I'm learning right now Reading is helpful. Podcasts are helpful, and then other people are helpful as well.
Mm.
And so for me, John, I don't necessarily read to be entertained. To be quite honest, I watch my daughter who loves reading, and she'll crank out the Hunger Games in 2 weeks in the summer, which is what she did last year. And by the Hunger Games, I'm talking the entire series, not just the first book. So I mean, so great for her, and we love that she loves to read. And so, but the love of so for me, it's more the love of learning rather than just the love of reading. And so I do think leaders are learners. And so as a leader, part of my responsibility is to learn and grow and develop. And the minute that I stop leading and growing or stop learning, I'm going to stop leading. And I don't want that. There's a responsibility there. So for me, the process that I go through generally is I want to identify, hey, what are some areas I want to grow in? If I'm going to try to put together a reading list or reading thoughts.
Yeah.
And it could be all over the place. And so it could be, hey, my faith, like you asked questions about what's my, parenting, was something that I wanted to just get better in this year. That's why I mentioned the parenting book, marriage, sometimes finances. And then of course, some ministry related specific books that I didn't share here because I didn't think, people necessarily care about all of those. But then it's, you can pick out a great list, but how are you going to do this? And one of the key principles I do, John, that helps me is I set a time period for a day of what I'm going to read. And this may not sound daunting at all, but I'll say I'm going to read 15 minutes a day for that leadership piece. And it's really around 7:30 a.m. when I do it with my breakfast. My kids are already taken care of. I've already, and here's maybe another principle. This is separate from my time with God. So my morning routine, I'll start with my time with God. I'll do my workout. I get home. When I'm eating and recovering from the workout, that's when I read. And I read 15 minutes a day, 5 times a week. And generally what that gets me is about a book and a half a month. But the reason why I encourage time over chapters is because we all know, hey, there's going to be some books that chapters are going to be really long, or books are going to be really long, whatnot. And so for me, I'm like, hey, make it time-based and just say, hey, 15 minutes a day, number of days a week. Most people who I encourage to do that say, you know what, I can do that. And then you do that and you see, hey, here's what I read and here's what I learned.
So if we're getting too in the weeds here, but I'm curious, like you're reading, you're doing your 15-minute check. Like, I want to make sure I read 15 minutes. I'm growing in this area. How do you make it so that you're not just reading to like, okay, I'm checking off the box and I'm supposed to read this book, right? Versus like, I want to engage with this in a way that's going to help me actually do something different in my life. It's going to actually make an impact, and I realize that maybe not every book's for everybody. And so there may be books that you read that you're like, it just didn't connect with me. But do you have like a goal number of like, I want this number of takeaways from a book, or if I read it 15 minutes, I want to gain one new thing. Like, do you have any of those types of like conversations or thoughts with yourself?
I don't usually do a number of takeaways or number of goals. I'm reading to see what am I taking away and what is specifically speaking to me at that point. So I'll take notes and I'll write down different highlights, and sometimes I'll share different thoughts. The one thing I do, John, is I mentioned I keep an Evernote file for each year, and each year I'll just list the book that I read and then 1 or 2 takeaways that just stood out to me. And that's usually what I can refer back to is like, hey, here's what I'm going to begin to practice, and here's what I'm gonna look at. So for the parenting, getting it right, like, oh, I'm going to parent for relationship. Like the relationship is the goal in mind, and I'm going to discipline towards relationship. Like those are some key takeaways, rather than like, man, I'm just gonna, hey, take this away because you broke this. It's like, no, I want to lead you in a way to restore this relationship that you broke when you didn't honor your mom this way. And so that's usually my practice for doing this. I'm not one that, and maybe this goes against some people's beliefs. If a book were to say, hey, here are the 10 key takeaways to implement and do this now, I might only take 1 or 2 of those that I look at my current life situation right now and say, this is what I'm going to do. And this leads to that most amount of change. I'm going to chew on this and think differently about this. And that's going to lead to this change. Honestly, sometimes I read books because friends of mine recommend it, and I read it and I'm trying to learn, hey, why did my friend recommend this? So the insight might be, I'm trying to understand the way that my friend is thinking, or, coworker is thinking, because they said so much about this, because I don't know. I'm like, hey, if Mark has talked about this, our lead pastor Mark's talked about this book 4 or 5 times in the last week, something's stirring inside of him. And if I want to understand exactly what's stirring inside of him, I might just pick it up and read it and just see what he's experiencing, because I respect him as a leader and as a friend, and think, hey, there's some value there.
Wow, that's a cool insight. Yeah, I hadn't thought of it that way, about somebody's recommending a book. How am I connecting it to what they value, their story? Why would it matter to them? That's a cool principle. I also know, for me, to add on to your notes thing, I know for me personally, something really sticks in my brain when I'm able to say it or talk about it. And so I know for me, if I'm talking about something that I'm taking away from a book, I know it will stick in my brain. I could write something down 100 times. And if I say it twice to somebody as I'm talking through with them, I'll remember it better. Yeah. And so I think that'd be my encouragement for people too. Like, as they're like going through a book, it's something like sticks with them. Tell somebody about it. Yeah. Obviously it should be in the right setting, but yeah. Yeah. Cool, man. Any final thoughts on books that you love, or the reading process, or note taking, or anything like that you'd want to share?
Final thing I would just share, if you're trying to jump into it, and if it's feeling like a chore, your book, let me give you the permission right now. Stop reading the book and pick up something that you're curious in, that you think will help you grow, help you take your next step. It's fine. You're not a horrible person or a horrible reader. You stop books midways. I think if we're all honest, we've all done that, and that's okay. The goal again is, at least on my side, what I would encourage, the goal is learning. I think learning should be enjoyable. Learn what you're interested in and go from there, and pick something you're interested in. I mean, honestly, if you're interested in a coaching book, pick up the coaching book. That's fine. Go for it. Do it. Yeah. And enjoy it. So,
dude, that's great. Thanks, man. Thanks for sharing your what you've been reading and learning, and what's impacted you, and just sharing some of that insight with us.
All right, man. Thanks for having me. Thanks again for listening, everyone.
Well, that was my conversation with Tyler, and I hope that you just added a few books to your summer reading plan. My specific takeaway, besides a list of great books that you can find in the show notes, is the concept of really letting the core principle takeaway from a book speak into your specific context. I love that idea, and I love how it can help you move from like a theoretical application to a much more practical one. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Ridge Podcast, and make sure to follow and subscribe so that you don't miss any hopeful and helpful conversations.